So let's talk through every single army in Warhammer 40k right now, with a talk about their army strength and how many games they tend to be winning on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to auspextactics, where today we're talking through the armies of Warhammer 40k with respect to a bit of tournament data. In this one, doing a big summary, going through every single army in the game, how powerful they're looking and why, and what are some of the things that they're using most commonly to vanquish their foes on the other side of the tabletop. At time of recording, there's now been 4 weeks or so worth of tournament data since 40k's last balance pass, which happened in October, and there's been a bit more time for people to get the feel of the armies with their new state in the game, try out what works and what doesn't, and give us a little bit more reliable data via tournament results and things, which is measured by a whole bunch of folks around the internet. I'll leave a link to StatCheck 40k, Meta Monday and Den of Fools down in the video description, all of which are pretty great places for checking out win rates. For this video though, I thought it could be interesting to take a look through the factions with the different gauges of strength that we have for them at the moment. For these videos I generally like to go through them in order of army win rate, which reflects the average amount of games that a person might win if they take an army to a tournament. It definitely doesn't give the entire picture, being skewed by things like the types of players that play each faction, and maybe represents more the average level of play with a somewhat good list as opposed to the top end of competitive play, which some people like to focus on. And there also will be further biases for things like sample size, which can add a bit of randomness, and different matchups and terrain setups can affect things too. Even with all that though, I still think it's probably the most helpful thing to the majority of 40k players out there, raw army power often being more important than the top end of high level play, unless you're one of the few talented types out there who's often fighting for the top tables on grand tournaments on the regular. For the higher end of competitive play, I think it's perhaps more interesting to take a look at the number of actual big tournament wins that factions get, perhaps highlighting the ones that work best at the top level, plus looking at the play rates of each faction as well, which is more of a sign of sort of general excitement and interest to put the army on the tabletop in a competitive setting. Usually a bit of a power between fun rules and updates and powerful rules and updates. Currently, compared with 40k's balance in the past though, Games Workshop's been running things fairly tight in terms of game balance in 10th edition. The vast majority of armies can compete with each other at both a casual and competitive setting. Things tend to be far more dependent on player skill and the army list being chosen as opposed to choice of faction. A huge number of factions are clustered around the mid-tier sort of 50% win rates or so, and there's only a few factions on the lower sort of 45% win rates sort of area, and just the one that really seems to stick out the top by a way. But just in general for game balance in 10th edition, things are far better than they've often been in the past for 40k. In any case though, let's get right into it, talk through each army in turn, going from weakest up to strongest in terms of win rates as the primary metric, what sort of things they tend to use for some of their strongest armies, and maybe a few faction weaknesses if there are any relevant ones. First up and lowest on the list to the point of needing a special mention are the Imperial Agents, pretty much unequivocally the most struggling faction in Warhammer 40k right now, and probably the least clutched as well given that they only really became a thing a little while ago, unless you're counting the Deathwatch players who had their army consolidated within the faction in a way that didn't please many people. At the moment it's maybe not entirely clear if Games Workshop actually want for them to compete at all, as opposed to just remaining a repository for allies, but it was kind of implied that they did want them to be on the same standing as other armies, giving them their own point section and 4 different detachments. I guess we'll wait and see if they get any major help with the next data slate. In any case, for the forces of the Inquisition, their tournaments have far less data than any of the other armies out there. It looks like only 1 in 200 people who attend grand tournaments is running Imperial Agents, easily the least played faction in the game by a long way. They haven't won any big events since the balance updates, and I've not seen any high placings at all either, and have a win rate overall of around about 40%, though it varies massively depending on where you look at it due to the low data. They only got their codex a little while ago, and then the last points updates didn't change anything for them, leading people to suspect that they might be saving any updates for the balanced data slate, given they're not really an army that can be fixed with points adequately. For how they play, they're basically a mishmash force of the Inquisition, lots of kill team retinue units, a few Grey Knights and Deathwatch in their transports, but they don't get any overarching unifying faction rule besides their allied agents rules, and are in a very odd space, basically having no detachment rule if you field them in their own right. They've got 4 detachments, and the one that's most commonly played is the Imperialis fleet. Most of the rest don't really add all that much more strength, and they're locked to certain datasheets, but the Imperialis fleet has some more interest, adding in some damage buffs, and a few interesting board control tricks with things like infiltrating, deep striking, and some reactive moves. In terms of trying to make them work, if you want damage dealers, it's going to be the Deathwatch Veterans and Grey Knight Terminators, which can be okay against sort of medium to heavy infantry, but they'll still struggle with monsters and vehicles. They need allied knights to help out with anti-vehicle role if you want to. and then just have lots of okayish options for chaff infantry. Things like subductors are fairly cheap and durable, and perhaps their best hope for competitive play is playing sort of board control and scoring shenanigans with the Imperialis fleet tricks. Kyria Draxus can help out with that a bit, with denying some shooting, and the assassins are quite good, particularly in Imperial Agents, having the option to flex one out for the other with their shadow assignment rule. In general though, they're an army with almost nothing but issues. They were weak and got nothing to help them when other weaker armies were buffed. They've got no faction rule, which hopefully could be a way that Games Workshop could add strength in a future balance update. Aside from allying in Knights, they don't really have any proper way to do good efficient anti-tank, and Deathwatch players have been particularly annoyed by the book. If playing by the official rules, you either have to choose between good access to the Deathwatch units and their fluffy detachment, or using the other Space Marine units that you might have collected, with things like Primaris units, and you can't do both, though Games Workshop did say that there's going to be some sort of fix for that coming in December. In any case, currently by all metrics they're pretty much the weakest faction in the game. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to the sponsor of today's video in Warhammer Combat Cards, who've been kind enough to fund a few bigger projects on the channel. They're basically a Warhammer 40,000 themed mobile game, where you collect a deck of cards and then fight them against others in short runs of battles, which could provide a bit of entertainment if you want something for some downtime. The idea is you fight cards against each other, level them up and unlock more builds and better abilities to improve your roster for next time. Their current mobile game is a reimagination of a very old Citadel card game. Kind of fun to see the classic versions of the Terminators and the old school Noise Marine on this one. The ideas remain somewhat similar into the newer age. You have a points cost on the top left of the card, health and wounds on the top right, and then each one having a range and melee damage plus some special abilities, such as the Space Marine Reaver gaining fear to debuff enemy cards across from it when it reaches level 2. In game, you're allowed to build a deck of up to 9 cards and up to your points cap, so you can have a few big powerful ones or a horde of smaller ones. You pick a warlord that gives your whole faction a slant, say Abaddon the Despoiler adding extra damage, or Deathwatch Captain Artemis damaging cards as they deploy, and then you basically have a 3 versus 3 card battle system when they all attack at the same time, fighting against a deck that's made by an opponent but controlled by an AI computer. The first team to slay the enemy warlord wins. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. There'll be links down in the video description, and there's a code down there, auspextactics, to get you started with some Space Marine cards and some other stuff. I'll circle back to talk a few more pros, cons and other things at the end of the video for those interested. Moving on with the armies of 40k though, aside from Imperial Agents which rather stick out at the bottom, the other more struggling factions in Warhammer 40k right now are clustered around about the 45% win rate, which isn't too terrible by 40k standards given that that's often Games Workshop's balanced target. They've often had lots of armies way weaker than that in the past. Now it is worth noting that all 4 of these have won multiple 5-round tournaments since the balance update happened just a few weeks back, so they're far from unplayable. Either way though, they do seem to be towards the low end of the 40k power spectrum, at least for the average player, and here we have Space Marines and Black Templars on 44, Dark Angels on 45, and Grey Knights on 46%. Seems that a good chunk of the loyalist Space Marines aren't having the best time of it right now. We'll start off with the big one in the Space Marines themselves. Their balance problems have been a talking point for basically the entirety of 10th edition so far. They've got win rates of 44%, which was a 3% improvement on the last update. They've won 3 big events at tournaments since the last update came around, and their competitive play rate is 3% of army selections, or around about 11 out of the 26 factions, which is very, very low for core Space Marines. That's pretty much the most collected faction out of any. The last update brought some positives, but also a lot of negatives. You have cheaper Guilliman, Uriel Ventress getting buffed, and a bunch of underwhelming datasheets became far more usable. The Ballistas Dreadnought, Invader ATV, and Reavers, and a bunch more. But they also had some nerfs to their best stuff, things like Fire Discipline, Eradicators, Jump Intercessors, and the Apothecary Biologists all went up in points, and they were some of the things that were most commonly played in competitive lists. As ever, the Astartes core rule was Oath of Moment, marking 1 unit in the command phase for big hit rerolls against them, and since they came out, their detachments have revolved around the 4 main strong ones. Vanguard Spearhead with its sneaky tricks, big infiltration and potentially return to reserves, and Gladiator Task Force with its fire discipline and movement buffs. They've tended to be the mainstay of the selections, with close range shooting Firestorm and vehicle heavy Ironstorm both seeing play as well. Ironstorm less so though since the nerfs it took. Out of chapter selections, the Ultramarines are easily the ones with the best options out of the codex now. Marnius Calgar and Uriel Ventress are both really efficient character datasheets. Guilliman's now an option that is being run in competitive events from time to time. And while some of the other characters out there are good, the other chapters can't really compete with that efficiency. After several layers of revisions, the majority of Space Marine datasheets are at least usable-ish now, and it more depends on the detachment being run for the things that you're most likely to want to use. They do have some common objective scoring units, things like scouts for the midfield, infiltrators for the backfield, maybe the combi weapon lieutenant and jump intercessors for a bit of secondary support perhaps. Otherwise, plenty of their gun vehicles can be scary enough fire support. Maybe some melee damage dealers in Land Raiders, perhaps the Land Raider Redeemer for its big Overwatch. Various flavours of their elite infantry are playable enough, often with certain combos with characters from chapters, and they can do alright. Despite the majority of stuff being at least playable in the right place, for the average player, Space Marines seem to be a little bit harder to win with than most. There's a bunch of factors that don't help with that. A massive unit pool might mean that there's a big difference between the average list that someone's likely to be able to turn up with versus the absolute optimum thing at one given time. Lots of people like to play their own chapters, like trying to say make the Imperial Fist or the Raven Guard work, and they're badly balanced right now. Plus there's the competition for the divergent chapters and whether or not just running sort of pseudo Dark Angels, just tacking on some Inner Circle companions and Azrael is flatly better than taking the Ultramarines characters. The gap on that does seem to have narrowed though, particularly with Games Workshop's latest nerfs to Dark Angels and Black Templars. There's still a good few data sheets that rarely crop up in competitive play too. I've still not seen many people using Reavers, Tactical Marines, the Firestrike turret and the Firstborn Dread, and quite a lot of stuff is more in the just about okay but not particularly exciting sort of mark. In any case, sounds like Games Workshop's going to be having some sort of update focused on Space Marines in December. It would be quite cool if they managed to make a few more reasons to play some chapters besides Ultramarines. Next up, and seeming to be around about joint lowest out of the other factions in the game besides Agents of the Imperium, we've got the Black Templars. They're also there on 44% win rate, which dropped a big 6% on their pre-balance update numbers. They still did manage to win a couple of events, I believe one with Gladius and one with Righteous Crusaders. They're really not being played very much though, 24th out of the 26 armies, possibly people being put off by the big increases that they got for points on Crusader squads, and Helbrecht and Grimaldus going up probably didn't help with that either. For their top army list, they still do tend to build around their Righteous Crusaders detachment, the one with the Templar vows that you select at the start of the game, often taking the Feel No Pain, though you can take damage dealing ones if it makes more sense, and their index otherwise has some nice melee support with things like locking stuff in combat, extra AP, and 10 houses bonus to put a 5+ Feel No Pain on a big squad. For their standout units, that certainly feels like it's shifted around. Sword Brethren can be really dangerous with the characters that they can buff. Helbrecht and the Emperor's Champion I still think are really quite fighty and usable for the points. I feel like you could still justify a big Crusader squad with the 5+ Feel No Pain enhancement, though it's going to be setting you back way more than it was before. And I've got some other interesting options with slightly cheaper Captain and Lieutenant style things with their unique versions, and their multi-melter bolt-on tanks often being a good deal, maybe the Impulsor in particular. I feel like their last balance changes were kind of unnecessary though. They were sitting on a fairly mid-tier win rate before, with most of their units getting a fair bit of play in game. The nerfs that they received just seemed a bit harsh considering that, and I feel like just flatly either reversing or toning down the changes so the nerfs aren't quite as bad would probably be a good decision to get them looking a bit more mid-tier once again. Next up, and also towards the lower end of tournament performance, we have the Dark Angels. Win rates are around about 45%, which is a small fall from where they were before. They have still managed to win 2 big tournaments since the update, typically using Gladius Task Force, which is their preferred detachment to play, with things like Advance and Charge being really quite good for getting Inner Circle companions and Deathwing Knights into melee. Unlike the Templars, the Dark Angels are really quite popular to play at big events currently. Their army list was really quite strong until the recent nerfs, and it seems that they're still the 7th most played army out of the 26, though I feel like it might drop off a bit. Now Dark Angels Gladius isn't one of the scariest lists out there. The last balance update nerfed Deathwing Knights and Azrael, and buffed Lionel Johnson and some of the Raven Wing, for a list that a lot of people were using to good success though. The Gladius nerfs that they got with the Eradicators and Repulsor with Fire Discipline and Apothecary Biologist, that whole combo went up by really quite a lot, though even so a few lists have still kept it, and a few have tried out some Hellblasters. Outside of Gladius, the other detachments don't see that much play. The Inner Circle Task Force is the most played out of the Codex detachments. They're still generally considered to be pretty much flat weaker than the Gladius, and one of their tournament wins was with a Stormlance list, which was interesting enough, doing things really quite differently. For their standout unit, Azrael still seems to be auto-include, as I would have guessed at 115 points. Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions are still really quite nice melee beatdown units. The Inner Circle tend to be joined by Judas here for their fights first, and Lionel Johnson is turning up in a lot more army lists. It's generally pretty solid and hard to deal with for 285 points, again with all that scary melee and fights first. Overall seems they've fallen off the power curve at least a little bit compared with where they were. I feel like perhaps the nicest way to buff them would be to actually give them incentive to take their Codex detachments, as out of the Divergent chapters, they're the only one that doesn't really seem to find much use for them in competitive play, which is kind of sad. Otherwise, I feel like a bunch of their other unique characters aren't really quite strong enough to compete with the generic ones, and Ravenwing still don't seem to be in the place where people want to run them as a primary army still. Finally, for these armies, slightly towards the lower end, we have the Grey Knights. They've got a win rate of 46%, which perhaps took a surprising fall of 4% after the last update. They've still managed to win a couple of big events, and tend to be kind of niche in terms of play rate, placing around about 21st out of the 26 armies in terms of people taking them to tournaments. It's kind of interesting to see them drop off a bit, particularly as the last balance update buffed small Terminator squads and Purgation squads, and they didn't really get any direct nerfs besides maybe secret mission changes being a little bit less good for them. I'm not sure if it's the result of just a bit of bad luck in a slightly lower played army for the first few weeks, maybe with people not feeling as inspired to put them on the table as they used to, or there's something more complicated going on and struggling to deal with some of the stronger stuff in the meta. In any case, Grey Knights do have the slightly unusual way of playing in 40k at the moment, units blinking on and off the board with teleport assault, Dread Knights rushing up the board with automatic 6-inch advances that they can then shoot and charge after, and a bunch of interesting other teleport movement shenanigans like 3-inch drops, Mist of Deimos to return to reserves, and the Citadel of Exigence. After a whole bunch of balance passes, most of their mainline units are really quite strong now. Dread Knights and Grandmaster Dread Knights tend to be a mainstay in just about every list for their anti-armour and anti-heavy duties. Terminators and Paladins are nice enough, escorting some of the various characters, Caldor Drago in particular, maybe Terminator Librarians, which are still used solo from time to time. Every power armoured variant is usable, strike squads for sticky objectives in particular, and the rest all have their draws in one way or another. In any case, the movement tricks definitely help them out with things like secondary objective scoring and making sure their units can get to the front lines when they need to. They do generally only get them so far though. Armies with a lot of toughness 11 or higher are still a problem for them to deal with, and they might struggle a bit more for direct damage dealing contests when they're fighting for primary objectives. In any case though, whatever the reason, they seem to be dropping down a little bit in the win rate stats, at least compared with the last few months or so. Moving onwards and upwards, we get to the lower mid-tier factions. These ones all solidly within Games Workshop stated targets in the past of 45 to 55%. They're still maybe on the slightly lower end of army performance out there, at least for the average player in the average game, even if, as with the rest, they can all punch up and win big events. I feel like at least 3 of these armies in particular, though, have a bit of criticisms you can make of their internal balance, with certain things just being really obvious and certain things being really bad. Putting them on the win rate chart, here they are a little bit above the rest. We've got Orks on 47%, World Eaters, Chaos Knights and Adeptus Custodes on 48%, and Tyranids on 49%. Realistically though, in terms of win rate numbers, I think being within 3% of winning half of their games is pretty impressive for balance numbers, only maybe losing 1 game in 20 less than the average. Starting with the lowest of these, we've got the Orks. Their wins are up to 47%, which was quite a big plus 5% improvement on the previous state of affairs that they had, having just been slightly over-nerfed following their codex, with a few key nerfs to Mega Knobs and other things putting them behind. They seem to be in a far better state now, and had a whole bunch of event wins on one weekend. I believe there were 4 tournament topping lists with a bunch of different detachments, and greenskin players are putting them back on the table a bit more, a play rate of around about 9th of the 26 armies, pretty much in line with where you'd expect them to be as a popular faction, I think. The last balance updates gave them a lot of help. It buffed their Mega Knobs by dropping them down to 35 points. Boys and Beast Snagger Boys both got cheaper and they were already good units. Kill Rigs, War Bosses, Commandos and plenty more also got help in their own way. Their core mechanic is calling the War for a massive turn of all-round melee buffs plus advance and charge. And for the detachments being used, they've got some really quite different ones that push the armies in different ways. War Horde as the general purpose melee violence one is still the single most popular, with things like nice sustained hits and good stratagems like -1 to wound, charge buffs, and extra critical hits in combat. That works well for loads of Orc units, though it seems the next most popular is Bully Boys at the moment. The Mega Knobs getting down to 35 points seems to have tipped the balance in making that good again, and otherwise both Green Tide and Dread Mob are also seeing play, though generally not making quite as big an impact. For stronger units, there's a bunch of things that are just good regardless of detachment. Most of the melee things like Boys, maybe Knobs, Beast Snagger Boys, led by War Bosses or Beast Bosses, jumping out of transports tend to be staples. Flash Skits are fairly nice for a bit of shooting and then some nice volume melee violence. Gretchen are great little cheap units for farming up some command points. Storm Boys can jump around scoring things. Gazgal and Mega Knobs is pretty nice, both in Bully Boys and in Warhorde. Kill Rigs are just all-round enormously efficient at 155 points, often delivering Beast Boys to the front, and Dread Mob can make a bunch of other keyworded stuff more relevant, though I'd still say that the Walkers and things still feel a bit mediocre even in that detachment, which is saying something given the massive buffs that it gives them. They still feel like an army that they've got a lot of kind of weak or underwhelming units though. A lot of Daka units and Boggies in particular feel like they're overcosted in various ways. I feel like they could do with another round of improvements of some sort to Walkers and Buggies to make a bit more of a vehicle-based Orcs list at least kind of viable. It's definitely on my wish list for the December update. for them to do something to either make the buggy data sheets or the Cult of Speed detachment stronger for running them. In general though, it's very nice to see them doing way better than pre-update. Next up, we've got the World Eaters, whose performance has dropped a touch since the last update, going down to 48% wins from around 53 or so. They still seem to be much played as a popular army, perhaps surprisingly so, at around about 10th most played out of 26 tournament armies, and they're still winning events despite a slightly lower win percentage, 3 big wins since the update. The last balance pass did bring a small amount of bad news for them though, Angron going up a bit, as did Spawn and the Master of Executions. The Winged Demon Prince got a small boost, but not really many people were using him to be honest. For the way they play, they roll their 8 dice and choose a couple of Blessings of Khorne for massive extra speed or extra damage or defense as needed. The Berserker Warband gives them +1 strength and +1 attack on the charge, helping favour aggressive melee if they needed any more encouragement. And besides that, they've got some nice damage stratagems and an auto-advance 6-1 which can be very scary coupled with their advance and charge. Currently, most of their unique units are really quite playable. Angron's still very strong at the slightly raised points cost. Pretty much everyone's still running him. They can do some massive scout moves with Lord Invocators and 8 bounds and Exalted 8 bounds. Berserkers and Rhinos are still good, even if they can't double surge move, but even just a normal one is pretty threatening on a mid-board objective. Jackals are nice and cheap to sticky objectives things, and perhaps re-roll some blessings dice, and things like the Lord of Skulls, Wardog Carnivores, and some Forge Fiends or Allied War Dogs can work for some fire support if you want. I'd say maybe compared with the past, their on-foot characters are just getting a bit pricey for what they do now. Both Khan the Betrayer and the Master of Executions do feel like they've got good abilities, but just are weirdly expensive, and are probably going to still make 8 bound the mainstay of their army list as a result. Otherwise though, World Eaters is always going to be a faction that have got a bit of a one-dimensional melee rush strategy that can work better or worse against certain armies out there, and might be a bit more terrain dependent compared with some factions with a whole load of units that need to reach combat and not get shot down while doing so without the best defensive stats. Next up, we've got some big stompy walkers of the Dark Gods. The Chaos Knights are around about the same sort of place as they were pre-update, 48% wins, which is a tiny improvement, 2 big event wins since the balance update, and sort of middling play rates at 17th out of the 26 armies. The last update gave them a bunch of buffs. The Abominant, Desecrator and Despoiler got points cuts, Brigands and Stalkers went down as well, and they were both very relevant as the sort of cookie cutter War Dog spam list often includes those two. They're still pretty much the Battle Shock faction, Harbingers of Dread, giving leadership debuffs and then some extra damage and defense on Battle Shocked things from turn 3 onwards if you can hand them out. Forged in Terror means that any damaged enemy units have to test and can genuinely swing some objectives, though it's a bit random. And then have a bunch of stratagems including the Walk Through Walls one for War Dogs, which can be powerful, and potentially getting turn 1 Doom and Despair, which could be a nice boost for a Titanic Knight. They also often make some good use of allied demons as well. Things like Nurglings, Plague Bearers and Beasts of Nurgle tend to be the mainstay, all having some good advantages and providing some cheaper units than the War Dogs for doing grunt work. In general though, just like their Imperial Knights, they've got big chunky stat lines and lots of scary guns and damage profiles, kind of hard to go too enormously far wrong with. For their strong list, they still seem to be broadly basically running War Dogs. War Dog Brigands and War Dog Carnivores are the mainstay of the vast majority of armies as they're just really efficient. That didn't really seem likely to change given that Brigands got a points cut in the last update. Beyond that, it looks like around about half of top lists are running a Titanic Knight of some sort, which actually feels like that could be an improvement compared with the past. I've seen lists using the Lancer, Desecrator, Atropos, Abominant and Rampager. Kind of cool to see at least some use of the Abominants now it's at its very cheap 365 points cost, but it's still very much that the focus is on the War Dogs with the big knights as an occasional sideshow, as opposed to being the main event that they should be. I still say that's probably the biggest issue for the faction. Games Workshop just has failed to make the big knights as the army focus. Basically for the 2.5 to 3 years that Games Workshop made them a faction, I think further points cuts at the right cost would eventually work fine, or if not some sort of further rules boost. They did gain that walk through walls thing which definitely helped, and otherwise they have the normal strengths and weaknesses of knights in being maybe a little bit simplistic in their playstyle with big chunky stat lines, damage and defense, plus their morale shenanigans can be a little bit random and the damage effects matter more late game. In general though, they still seem to be winning a bunch of games and also occasionally topping tournaments. I noticed there was another big undefeated list at last weekend's grand tournaments as well. Next up, we've got the Golden Boys of the Adeptus Custodes, winning around about 48% of games, which is pretty similar to their previous. Just the one big event win since the balance update with Talons of the Emperor, though not too many people taking them to grand tournaments at the moment. 18th most played out of 26 armies is kind of low in terms of play rate for them. The last balance update felt kind of light touch for them, slightly cheaper Virtus Praetors, Trajan and the Dreadnoughts, all of which definitely seem like sensible changes for internal balance, though they all felt maybe a little bit light touch to the point where I don't think people are necessarily going to run those units for list building. Their playstyle tends to be a big indomitable wall of golden infantry marching up to the mid-board objectives with massive stat lines and big melee to smash down enemies that come out to meet them, boosted by the martial Qatar in the fight phase, getting either sustained or lethal hits, plus potentially some extra boosts from Shield Host if you're running that. The Shield Host is still the most played detachment, though a few people are using Talons of the Emperor. Both of them have some interesting options and stratagems, and the Talons ones are nice enough for skirmishing in the mid-board, even if the core buff isn't quite as strong. And army lists do tend to be a bit convergent these days, often Blade Champions leading units of Custodian Wardens tending to be the most popular choice for the main battle line. Then perhaps one unit of Custodian Guard with Kyria Draxus, maybe some Venatari Custodians for their rapid ingress, and then some Lance Melee with Guardian Spears, some Sisters of Silence for some actions and objectives, maybe a Caladius a tank or two for a bit of long-range scary anti-tank firepower. And there's a few other things that remain pretty playable, but maybe not as commonly used, things like the Shield Captains, Trajan, Alaris Terminators, and a few more options. Still feels like maybe with internal balance they've got a bit of a way to go. It'd be nice to have the Bites and Terminators being a little bit more commonly played for their unique stuff, and I guess they could have another go at making the other detachments get to a point where they're somewhat competitive, though I feel like you'd have to do lots more for the Sisters of Silence detachment. In general, Custodes tend to be, again, like Knights, one of those sort of stat check armies. They can be really quite oppressive at a casual de-optimized list sort of level, but maybe not win as many grand tournaments, and that seems like it is holding true for win rates at tournaments this time around. Next up, we've got the Forces of the Hive Mind in the Tyranids, winning 49% of games, so pretty well perfectly balanced there, neither too strong nor too weak. Two big tournament wins since the update. I think it was Synaptic Nexus and Vanguard Onslaught for those ones, and one of the most popular factions in 40k currently, third most played out of the 26 armies, a massive influx of people starting with Leviathan, and Games Workshop have the faction in such a place that it's interesting to put them on the table in a competitive setting, and lots of people are enjoying doing so. Again for them, the balance update was kind of light touch last time around, trying to even up the trade-offs between Carnifexes and Old One-Eye, due to never really seeing the Carnifexes without him. Winged Hive Tyrants and Von Rise Leapers dropping, and Lictors and some individual Pyrovores going up a touch. Nothing really that made any too fundamental changes to the army though. Their core rules have Synapse and the Shadow in the Warp to cause a disruptive turn of Battle Shock, often at -1 with a Neuro Tyrant, and Synapse now adds some strength in close combat, which has been a big deal for certain units like the Norn Emissary, which is seeing a lot more play. They're certainly far scarier at strength 10 than 9. For the detachments being run, Invasion Fleet, Synaptic Nexus, and Vanguard Onslaught are all doing rather well. Invasion Fleet with some nice feel no pain and some damage boosts, Synaptic Nexus with some helpful things getting to melee and some nice rerolls that can work for shooting units, and Vanguard Onslaught having all sorts of sneaky tricks jumping on and off the board. Crusher Stampede with its monster support is also getting a fair amount of success, which is cool to see. Looks like the objective and that stratagem change did genuinely help them out a bit. Otherwise for the army, the vast majority of stuff is usable enough in the right detachment. All the lone operatives are basically fine and offer different things. For mainline damage dealers, it's maybe a bit convergent with things like Exocrines and Tyrannifexes putting out the majority of scary firepower, maybe buffed by the stratagems and lethal hits of a Hive Tyrant. Maliceptors are nice enough to have on the front line. Gargoyles have their fun movement tricks, and some of the other gaunts are usable enough. Neurotyrants are efficient with their Shadow in the Warp plus their profile, and can be leading some big squads of Zoanthropes to protect their firepower from being locked up. As mentioned, Norn Emissaries are fairly nice, and Biovores are still pretty good for secondary work, throwing down some Spore Mines for interference, and also just being a nuisance model in the backfield. They still do have some underpowered units, things like Toxicrins, Flyers, Spore Assists, maybe Ranged Warriors. And despite all the improvements, they still tend to have a slight weakness against tough stuff, with only really the Tyrannifex doing really great dedicated anti-tank, but it's no longer quite as brutal as it used to be. In general, the bugs feel like they're in at least a fairly good place, middling win rates with the vast majority of their units and most of their detachments being competitively playable. I guess on that front, some sort of help for Unending Swarm or Assimilation Swarm, both would be fairly well appreciated. Next up, we've got rather a lot of factions clustered around the extreme middle of 40k. All of these armies are exactly on or roughly around 50%, and here we've got the Aeldari, Drukhari, Thousand Sons, Space Wolves, Tau Empire, Chaos Space Marines, Imperial Knights, and Adeptus Mechanicus. It's pretty nice to see so many armies making up the mid-tier, with plenty of ability to do well, particularly given that for a big chunk of these, the vast majority of datasheets in their indexes and codexes are usable. Putting them on the big graph, they form a good fairly flat part of the bell curve, before we get onto the stuff that's rising above them a little bit. Focusing on each one in turn quickly, first up we have the Aeldari, going up from 48% to 50% wins, being far more niche than they have been earlier in the edition though. Their play rates have basically been gradually dropping ever since the big power trip that they had at the start of the edition, and they've just had the one bigger event win. Last balance update gave them a bunch of buffs: Corsairs, Shining Spears, Warlocks, a bunch of Grav tanks, and small squads of Wraith Guard and Wraith Blades dropping down a bit. A few of those have been turning up in competitive lists, which I'd say for the Aeldari already had a fair bit of diversity, people deciding to use the faction and their units in really quite different ways. Their core rules give them some great dice manipulation, Strands of Fates to give you the chance to plug in some good dice when you need it, particularly changing them to 6s with a Farseer nearby, the detachment rule giving them their very nasty reroll a hit and wound roll for flat extra damage, and most of their stratagems revolving around good movement tricks with things like Phantasm, Fire and Fate, and a few other fun ones. Some of their enhancements are usable enough as well, things like the Phoenix Gem to resurrect an Autarch Wayleaper while he's going around doing lone operative things and rustling up command points. After all their balance revisions, the majority of units feel like they're playable enough but not auto-include. Maybe for slightly overrepresented ones, Farseers are pretty great for their fate dice manipulation and the -1 to wound, often backed up by Guardians for some more dice or sticky objectives depending on what you want. Given the big battle host rerolls, they can access some great anti-tank firepower between War Walkers, D-Cannon support batteries, and Falcons and Fire Prisms will compete better with them now. They've got fast units for objectives, Warp Spiders with their 24-inch jump can basically auto-complete certain secondaries pretty much, and Swooping Hawks are nice and efficient with their jump on and off the board. Striking Scorpions often tend to be a go-to choice for some infiltrating and some scarier melee, though I have seen some people using Rangers as well, and the Avatar of Cain can be a nice bastion of raw strength to dominate a mid-board points, perhaps particularly with a -1 to wound from a Farseer. The Inari variant of the army can be really quite strong as well, maybe led by Ivrain with a Harlequin troop, and then basically after that going very heavy on the Drukhari units that aren't necessarily super costed for the battle host rerolls, adding in some nice extra damage to Scourges or Ravagers, and a few other utility units like Mandrakes maybe. In general, they seem to be fairly well balanced now. Maybe biggest weaknesses could be reliance on quite a lot of fragile units, which means that certain things can be bad for them, anything from low terrain boards, or enemies that move super fast or 3-inch deep strike like Tempestus Aquilons, and they might have a bit less presence on primary objectives even if they're unusually strong on secondaries. Broadly speaking, they seem to be in a pretty good place though, at least in a competitive setting. For their Darkkin, we've got the Drukhari, also on 50%, their win rate having been shaved off quite considerably since the last update. They were sitting on one of the best ones in 40k before though, around about 55%, now they're down to 50. They've still won one big event since the balance update, with Mr. Scary using Real Space Raiders I believe, but not as many high placings since that, which certainly feels like an about turn given that they were topping really quite a lot of tournaments pre-update. It does look like the points changes have had a big effect on their tournament wins at the top level. The balance updates toned down a lot of staple units, Archons, Drazar, Incubi, Mandrakes, Reavers, the Court of the Archon, the Beastmaster, although they did get a buff to Hellions, and they do seem to be seeing some play in Real Space Raiders in particular. The army rules power from pain, so generating pain tokens and plugging them into reroll hit rolls and potentially some AP in melee. It seems now that after those points changes, given the nerf to a lot of things that really enjoyed Sky Splinter, it looks like if anything the Real Space Raiders seems to be taking the lead now. Plenty of people are now using each detachment, with the Raiders ones having more success versus Sky Splinter, which is a pretty massive about turn from where they were before the update. The Real Space Raider ones tend to favour more things like the Covens things, particularly Talos, which I think were always there as a very scary datasheet for the Drukhari, just not really used that much when their entire detachment tended to support transport things. Otherwise, pretty much most of their index is very playable. Razors and Venoms with things like Leo Hesperax with her Witches, or Archons with Incubi are still good in Sky Splinter with their Lance melee. Scourges remain a staple with move, shoot, move and firepower that you can't do much about. Ravagers are still good for a few Dark Lances if you want some in the backfield. Mandrakes cost more but can still do infiltration and teleporting around scoring points. At least one Kronos seems fairly auto-include to me for its ability to farm pain tokens plus kind of crazy defensive stats for just the 50 points. Grotesque can do fine in melee and seem to have been having some success in Real Space Raiders. Beastmasters can scout the way and potentially pimp out the enemy, and Cabalite Warriors and Venoms can be very nice for zooming around and handing out some sticky objectives. Seems that overall they're in a fairly good place, a lot more in line with other armies' win rates. In general though, they aren't considered to be quite as strong compared with some at winning top events, though certainly more so after a whole bunch of nerfs. Next up for another army that had win rates at the top of the tree last time round but got heavy nerfs with 1,000 Suns. They're down at 50% from around about 56 before the update. They're still managing to win their fair share of tournaments Three biggest events since the balance update came out. They are one of the very least played factions in 40k currently, 23rd out of the 26 armies at tournaments. With the points hikes after the update, that does seem to have had a fair few people choose to play other things, it would seem. The update did hit a whole bunch of their staple units, big nerfs to Magnus, Ahriman, several of their sorcerer patterns, plus the Infernal Master. The Mutilith Vortex Beast, Forge Fiend, Zangor Enlightened, and smaller Rubric squads, the only buff being two bigger Rubric squads which went down a bit. They still aren't enormously common played in their bigger damage dealer format. They do sacrifice having an extra Cabal point if you take them that way. The army's core rule is Cabal of Sorcerers, generating points for their psychic units to put towards some cool spells, all of which can be really quite powerful manipulating the game, throwing a whole bunch of mortal wounds exactly where needed around with Doombolt, and having a couple of ways to double up on it, and otherwise extra movement, defending against saves, or extra AP when shooting and things. The detachment rule buffs psychic damage, which is perhaps most meaningful for Magnus himself, and the rest of their enhancements are all usable for the Cabal manipulation and the Umbralific Crystal for the teleport move, which can be nice with secret missions potentially. Thousand Suns list don't really seem like they've changed the pattern too much compared with pre-update. Magnus is still in basically every single list, heading up a contingent of sorcerers, though maybe not quite as many Infernal Masters being spammed as before, usually leading up small squads of Rubrics for Cabal points and scary Warp Flamers and Soul Reapers, then likely a Mutilith Vortex Beast or two supporting, some cheap supporting chaff to do objectives and things. And it still seems that despite the repeated points cuts and then nerfs to other things, the Scarab Occult Terminators are still being left on the shelf. I think it's perhaps getting to the point where they're not quite so behind the curve compared with the rest of things though, given the points changes. Overall still seems that they can compete even if you're getting far less stuff on the table than you used to. This very much do feel like they're building around maximising smart use of their core mechanic, and it's an army that maybe has to make some bigger decisions compared with some really quite different ways that you can use those Cabal points, and having to think very carefully as to what you do with Magnus, as you can't really afford for him to take too much of a backseat being how expensive he is, or to get him killed and focused too early, so maybe takes a bit of judgment calls with what to do with him. Next up, we've got their bitter rivals in the Space Wolves, who again have also dropped down a little bit from the last update. Again, they've been doing rather well with a combination of Champions of Rust and Thunderwolf spam, and now around about 50% wins. 2 event wins since the update, I believe one with Champions and one with Stormlance, and again are a slightly lesser played faction at 20th of the 26 armies. I feel like they're a slightly less eclectic army at the moment, while waiting for a presumed Primaris update. The last points changes hit their Thunderwolves rather hard, they went up 20 points, and Bjorn and Logan increased as well. Several lesser played units got dropped a bit, and they had some of the Space Marine changes, some of which were helpful, some of which hurt a little bit, like the Jump Intercessor nerf. After the update, it looks like lists are being a little bit more widely varied. Champions of Rust seems to be the most popular way to play them. Now starting with a Saga active for some nice feel no pain, plus a bunch of interesting melee tricks and the opportunity to unlock other Sagas as the game goes on. They usually tend to run character and leader heavy and often take Bjorn, though quite a lot of variation as to specifically what gets the nod there. And otherwise Stormlance still seems to be pretty alive and well, focusing heavily on Thunderwolf spam with their good supporting characters there. Looks like with all the support and stratagems that you get there, Thunderwolves are really justifiable there, but no longer quite as hot compared with other melee choices for other detachments that don't have focal mounted buffs. Otherwise, besides things mentioned, Ragnar Blackmane can still be a massive damage threat, maybe backed up with some Assault Intercessors for rerolls. Wolfrunners still pack a punch with their damage 2 hammers even if they don't have OC, and beyond that there's lots of things playable both out of the Space Wolf and the core Space Marine Codex, usually having some focus on melee, but backing up with a few powerful gun tanks isn't the worst either. In general, it does still look like they're doing a good job of being basically Space Marines but slightly better, and the Stormlance being the one that plays very, very differently. Maybe having a few more obvious strengths and weaknesses with those big cavalry bases having to go around terrain, but lots of speed that can potentially pen the opponent in the deployment zone if they want to. Next up, we've got the Tau Empire, who also seem to be solidly in the middle of the field. Maybe up a tiny little bit in win rate since last time round, and 2 tournament wins since the update, I believe 1 Monk card and 1 Retaliation Cadre. They're one of the most popular armies to put on the table in the competitive game at the moment still though, placing 4th out of 26 armies. I feel like in general their codex hasn't done the worst for them really, the vast majority of their units being able to be used and pretty much all their detachments being playable now. The Kroot one's still really quite niche and focused around those specific units, but got far more interesting after the points updates where lots of their units dropped down including the Rampagers and the regular Carnivores. Otherwise in the update, Farsight got a points cut and Riptides and Piranhas went up a little bit as they were 2 of the biggest staple things. For the way that Tau play, they've got there for the greater good with the paired unit plus 1 ballistic skill buff for units coordinating with each other. potentially very powerful, but also means that losing some units can have some inefficiencies, particularly if you lose stealth suits, which are sort of necessary for the raw power of the army with their rerolls. And as mentioned, their detachments are rather well balanced. Retaliation cadre may be having the most success at the moment, generally going heavy on crisis suits led by a commander in each unit, maybe with some Riptides or Ghost Kills to support. Otherwise, for more mainline damage dealers, Hammerheads and Skyrays are both nice, Riptides are good to have on the front line, and Ghost Kills can be good in Kauyon with their ability to inflict some firepower and not die. Breaches in Devilfish are very nice in Montcar and Kauyon, Pathfinders are solid. Farsight can be good in Retaliation cadre with the drop close stratagem for cheap. Piranhas can throw out some Seeker missiles and move block in the early game, and even outside the Kroot detachment some of their units can be useful, like some Carnivores for sticky objectives. Stealth suits remain absolutely auto-include of course. Overall, looks like the Forces of the Greater Good are pretty well balanced, both in power, detachments, and units being usable, certainly in a better state than the majority of things out there in 40k. They still have their normal strengths and weaknesses, with units not usually being enormously tough, and not wanting to get into melee means that there can be some difficult decisions with taking the mid board in the early game, so it can take a bit of judgment with the enemy army as to what they can afford to push up with, and what important guns need to stay safe till later. Next up, we've got the Core Heretic Astartes and the Chaos Space Marines. These guys broadly got buffs in the last balance update, with a lot of their units dropping down. Things like Abaddon, Vashtor, Obliterators, the Predator Annihilator, Havocs Possessed and Terminators, and bigger squads of certain units, all slightly balanced with the nerf to Accursed Cultists, with their surge moves not triggering multiple times, and Dark Communes going up as well. It seems to have had a positive effect on their win rates though, going up about 5% from 45 or so to 50. They've won 4 tournaments since the update, which is more than most, though they are one of the slightly more played factions out there, at 8th most played out of 26. Their core rule is as ever the Dark Pacts, taking leadership tests and risking some mortal wounds for some nasty sustained or lethal hits, which generally makes them a fairly aggressive and high damage army. And then out of the detachments, Renegade Raiders is still overall the strongest and most played. Units gaining lots of speed with advancing and shooting and extra AP on objectives, plus some other really nice stratagems like Advance and Charge and an Armour of Contempt equivalent. Besides that, Veterans of the Long War and Pact-Bound also both have been doing well, both adding some interesting strength in their own ways. Soulforge Warpack can work and does get play, but doesn't tend to be the sort of army that wins at higher levels, as it's maybe a little bit more predictable and just relying on some mass damage. And it's kind of interesting that Chaos Cult is still one of the armies that can absolutely do nasty things at a top tournament level. Seems that despite the points increase to Accursed Cultists and Dark Communes and the Surge move nerf, it's still very much alive and well, and people are still struggling to deal with the Accursed Cultist Dark Commune on midfield objective whole thing, as it can give you some serious problems with how you move up to take those objectives and not just wind up in combat and unable to shoot the things anymore. I think the last balance updates did a lot of good stuff for internal balance. Most stuff is fairly playable in its own way. Perhaps for bigger staples, things like Chosen and Legionaries led by Lords and Rhinos are hard to go too far wrong with. Vindicators, Predator Destructors and Obliterators seem to be coming back as nasty fire support. If you want to amp up Dark Packs, then Abaddon and Hellbrutes can take the damage of certain units absolutely through the roof. Cultists provide some sticky objectives, Accurses can still be very nasty and scary on the midfield. Chaos Bikers are really cheap and efficient for some objective skirmishers with more damage than you might expect, and different lists are often using other elites now such as Possessed, Warp Talons and Terminators, all of which were a bit niche before the update. In any case though, looks like they're in a good place, a fairly good win rate for most people and topping some tournaments. They still do have some overshadowed units such as the Lord Discordant, Helldrake, and feels like maybe their balance of Demon Engine style damage dealers isn't quite as good as it could be. And in general, maybe the biggest challenge is overall coordinating dangerous damage profiles into enemy units that matter, while not getting them killed with sort of okay defensive stat lines that aren't super standout. Next up, we've got some other big stompy walkers, also on win rates around 50%, kind of similar to where they were before. 3 biggish tournament wins since the balance update, and right in the middle in terms of army selections, 13th out of 26 most played in the game. The last points updates helped out a few of their Titanic Knights a bit, drops for the Gallant, Errant, Castellan and Valiant. I feel like the Errant and the Castellan maybe were the standout winners out of that one. A small nerf of 15 points for Canis Rex, and the Subductor squad increased if you want to ally it in from Imperial Agents, though Canis Rex seems to have gone nowhere and still is in the vast majority of army lists, even at 350 points. Their core rule is their Code Chivalric, giving them some nice damage rerolls, plus potentially some command points if they slay the Warlord. The big knights can buff the small ones with Bondsman abilities, and the Titanics can smash straight through walls now, which was a big boost to them being able to deal with terrain. And otherwise their detachment gives them a feel no pain that gets better if they're honoured, and a few powerful stratagems such as rotate ion shields, fights on death, and the Mysterious Guardian enhancement that can teleport a knight to do some scary close range shooting if it wants to. For their absolute staples, it still seems that Canis Rex is easy enough to justify at 450. No major surprise from me there with his free stratagems and just pretty massive general purpose damage output at range and melee. Both the Armiger Warglaves and Armiger Helverins are pretty necessary for holding the front line and the backfield. And then for other Titanic Knight variants, some of the most popular are the Atropos, Errant, Lancer, and maybe Castellan. Though realistically, most of them are usable enough. They can still get a lot of value out of Imperial Agents, maybe a Calidus Assassin to go jumping around the board doing secondary objectives, and just have a unit that's a little bit cheaper than a Warglaive or Helverin to do that. For their downsides, they often tend to be a little bit basic and predictable, with big stat lines stomping up and trying to destroy the enemy army and win the game through sheer might. Even with a Titanic boost, they can be hampered by terrain more so than most, and have other weaknesses like if the enemy's got excess anti-armor, and they might struggle more than some for the Pariah Nexus actions, either having to give up melee with big knights or commit expensive armigers to them. As ever, they generally tend to be better in more casual metas and small events versus great big tournaments, though it still seems to have been doing okay on the top tables, at least in the last few weeks. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus, also on 50% win rates, and again more or less the same as they were prior to the update. They're the only army out of any of them besides Imperial Agents, though, that haven't won a big event since the balance update. Perhaps not having the best odds to show if they can, though, given that they're the least played army aside from Imperial Agents, only 1% of people taking them to tournaments, and 25th out of the 26 armies. It does feel like really quite a small cohort of good players are doing well with them and managing to make them work. The last balance update I felt brought slightly more nerfs than buffs, some fairly direct nerfs to the Skitarii Hunter cohort with Cerberus, Vanguard, Iron Striders and Taraxi all going up, not really outweighed by the Onager, Scatros and Electro Priest point drops in my opinion. The army is definitely in a better place than it was post-Codex release though, with the Doctor Imperatives now affecting more units and being more meaningful across the army, giving heavier assault and +1 to hit at either range and melee, and then a third buff if battle lines nearby. And in terms of detachments being run, it still looks like Hunter cohort is still the most successful and most played. It definitely took hits with those units going up, but they've got some very nice synergies with a lot of good Skitarii units, infiltration and move shoot move type tricks, and manipulation of the Doctriners. The next most played is Radzone cohort, which is also fairly strong and doing okay. You can have some very scary Tech Priest led Catastron breaches in there. For standout units, the Skitarii battle line unit is going to be as important as ever, handing out some key buffs to other units with the Doctriners and datasheet rules. Catastron breaches are really scary, and nice general purpose gun turrets with a Manipulus. The Sidonian Dragoons can be some powerful melee chargers, and they've got lots of options for fairly cheap board control units, Taraxi, Infiltrators and Cerberus Raiders. I feel like with the Iron Strider increase there's actually a fair bit more balance between the big guns of the army for once, with the Onagers, Scorpius tanks and Iron Striders all seeing some use. It's kind of nice to see the actual big gun tanks being used as such more than they were before. For downsides, aside from them being a horrendously expensive army to collect, in practical terms they still maybe feel like a slightly higher skill army to play. Some big options and decisions between the Doctriners and the Skitarii stratagems, and maybe my biggest criticism of their units would still be the Castellan robots. Usable enough in Cybernetica cohort maybe, but only kind of okay there, and I feel like they could gain a bit of strength overall. Moving onwards to armies only a little bit above the curve, there's a bunch on 51%. Again, in win rate terms, not really meaningfully ahead of the others, but maybe looking like they're a touch more on the upper end of mid-tier as opposed to central with it. Putting them on the table, here we have the Necrons, Blood Angels and Leagues of Votann. If talking about top tournament performance though, it seems that Necrons are the ones to watch out of these ones. Despite a fairly middling win rate, people seem to have more faith in them winning grand tournaments. Starting with them, I suppose, their 51% win rate is kind of unchanged since prior to the update. They've had 4 big event wins since, and are currently the single most played competitive army, accounting for 7% of Grand Tournament army selections, showing people are enjoying the army and have lots of faith in them doing well. The last update had some nerfs that seemed to focus around Hypercrypt, though also some buffs to weaker things. They increased costs on Death Marks, individual Locust Destroyers, Locust Heavy Destroyers in general, and the Monolith and Tesseract Vaults, but buffed the already good Doomsday Arc, had a big drop for Triumph Praetorians down to 100 points. A few other things got reductions, and also the Silent King gains the Triarch keyword, so is actually useful in obeisance phalanx. The core rule for the army are the reanimation protocols, repairing and reviving models, and can give the opponent some target priority issues with having to try and focus down units if possible. They tend to be most valuable if you've got some way to buff them, or if they're helping out something excessively durable like Catan. For detachment choice, Hypercrypt Legion still seems to be the go-to, teleporting Necrons around Grey Knight style, which can be helpful for getting Catan a little bit further up the board. Very nice for secondary scoring with cheap objective grabbers still. often with a monolith still as a bastion of strength and some extra teleport tricks, and Doomsday Arcs able to line up beads on their target more easily. Otherwise, Awakened Dynasty seems to have gained some ground on Hypercrypts, with the nerfs that seem to focus on that detachment. They've got their +1 to hit with leaders and some really strong combos, plus some cool stratagems. They often get on quite well with Canoptek Reanimators as well, having the ability to reactively reanimate and double down on the goodness with that. And Obeisant's Phalanx actually seems to be seeing competitive play in a somewhat convincing way now the Silent King is usable for it, and both the Triarch units dropped a lot. Will be interesting to see if that actually takes off to be one of the main competitive detachments after people discover it. Otherwise, for stronger units, Catan is still very hard to go wrong with, massive bastions of toughness and damage, perhaps particularly the Transcendent Nightbringer and Void Dragon. Immortals with leader combos can stack a whole load of Tesla fire on objectives, maybe backed up by Plasmancers or Chronomancers, Imatech or Illuminor Seras. Doomsday Arcs seem to have become the go-to fire support, and just seem a bit better than the Locust Heavies and the Doomstalker now for general purpose. Wraith and Technomancers can still be very durable if you want them. Lots of the individual small stuff is good in Hypercrypt teleporting around like Hexmark Destroyers. Scorpec Destroyers and Lords and Lichguard with maybe Imatech are rather nice in Awakened Dynasty. As mentioned, they quite like their Canoptek Reanimators there as well, able to ping back units to a lot of health very quickly. Overall, broadly speaking, Necrons seem to be having a pretty good time of it. Maybe for criticisms, I feel like their heavy fire support balance has got worse rather than better, with the Doomsday Arc being the obvious go-to now, and Warriors still seem a touch underpowered, even if they've been featured in a couple of strong lists, and there's still a few units that just don't see play that much. In general though, it's not really such a bad situation for them. A lot of their stuff's usable, and plenty of detachments work as well. Not a terrible time to be a robot skeleton in 40k maybe. Next up, we've got the Blood Angels, who had the last balance update as the launch for their codex. It does seem to have negatively impacted their win rates, dropping down by 3% or so. They're really quite a popular army to put on the table at the moment, with the 5th most played out of the 26 armies, I guess with a bit of excitement around their codex and their model release wave. Though so far they haven't had quite as much success on the top tables, just the one big event since the balance update. Even if a fair few other armies have got close, that does feel kind of notable for a pretty popular faction. Aside from their standard Space Marine rerolls, they tend to use the Liberator Assault group. It's basically only that being played, and nobody really experimenting with the Angelic Host. The Liberator group gives you +2 strength and +2 attacks on the charge, Red Rampage for even more damage, the scary possibility to advance and charge with very nasty jump infantry, and a terrifying Smash Captain with its sustained hits 3 that it can trigger on the same turn as the +3 attacks thing, and just utterly demolish something on the mid-board objectives. For stronger units, Mephiston, the Lord of Death, seems to be one of the most common picks, a lone operative with just some pretty good all-round damage and defensive stats, good for utility and a bit of killing some medium infantry. The Sanguinor's also fine if you wanted to double down on that kind of theme. A big unit of Death Company makes an appearance in most army lists, often being led by Lamartes, sometimes Astarath. Assault Intercessors and Captains do very nicely in Liberator, maybe jumping out of impulsors to get them there and perhaps using that Smash Captain. Dante and the Sanguinary Guard are a pretty massive melee threat, and it seems that a few of the better performing tournament lists have actually taken an interesting mix of Blood Angels melee plus some scary Space Marine gun tanks to back them up. I guess weirdly having some synergy between a bunch of firepower and then a whole bunch of scary melee units that you really don't want to get anywhere close to. Overall, things don't really look too bad for them. I'd say their biggest criticism is that the Lost Brethren and Angelic Host just aren't really being played at all. Maybe could do with some sort of rules boost if Games Workshop do want them to compete, and otherwise maybe the on-foot Death Company feel a little bit undertuned with their limited access to scary weapons, and same with the new style Death Company Dreadnought. Doesn't look like those surge moves are enough to tempt people to put it in their army lists. Next up, we've got 40k Space Dwarves in the leagues of Votann, win rates of 51%, which is a small improvement on last time, though they have dropped down from the good success they had in the first couple of weeks or so of tournament performance. They've still won 3 big events over the last few weeks overall, and have been played kind of middling at 16th out of the 26 armies. Nothing's really changed too much for them. The last points update had Hurricane Jaegers get a small nerf, but they're still very usable, and small Hearthguard squads got a buff down to 150 points. And that does seem to have tipped the balance where they're perhaps more often being run in 5-man squads, with a few less people choosing to use the big deep striking 10 blocks to maximise the sustained hits. Their core rules give them a whole load of damage. I have the Ancestors and Ruthless Efficiency to hand out lots of judgment tokens for +1 to hit and wound, and then generally tend to focus around damage and defense stratagems, things like void armor, reactive reprisal, or sustained hits on shooting. Their index doesn't exactly have a crazy amount of options, though with Games Workshop's balance of it at the moment, I'd say literally everything's playable and most things are fairly strong. The Hearthguard are a staple, maybe some being transported in land fortresses who like the conversion beamers, and scouting Sagittars to transport some Chthonian Berserks or small squads of Hearthkin. Likely one squad of Jaegers in a 2000 point list to hold the midboard. Hunkin Pioneers are a staple with all their autocannons, and maybe the other characters and Thunderkin perhaps a little bit less played compared with the rest, though usable if you want to make them work. The main issue perhaps tends to be not a lot of sneaky tricks beyond their fairly big scary damage that they can hit out with, and maybe doing a bit better against armies that they can really focus loads of fire upon. In general, they've tended to do a little bit better at casual levels of play versus top tier competitive. They certainly seem to be doing kind of fine at the moment. Next up, and a little bit above here once again, we've got some of the stronger factions in Warhammer 40k right now by win rate. I feel like these ones generally do stick out just a little bit in terms of in-game power, maybe a bit more notably so than some of the ones below. Though again, I'd still stress that 52 to 53% wins is well within Games Workshop's win targets, and if these are the majority of the top factions of the game, then they're not doing so badly. Out of the armies here, the Astra Militarum are the ones that seem to be winning the most of the tournaments, maybe followed by the Sisters of Battle, perhaps having just a little bit more super top level potential versus the Death Guard and Daemons. There's also the one faction that sticks up far above these, and we'll get to them in a second. In any case, here we are on the win rate chart. Adepta Sororitas and Astra Militarum on 52%, and then Death Guard and Daemons on 53%. For Sisters, I think people were generally expecting them to still be a strong army despite the nerfs they got. They were arguably one of the single strongest factions in 40k prior to the update, and while their performance has been curtailed a bit by the nerfs, they've only dropped down to like 52% win rate from 55 or so. Still won 3 grand tournaments and had plenty of good placings besides. Their play rate has fallen off a little bit though, they're now sort of more middling taken in 40k. That's still kind of good for them as they're slightly less eclectic compared with some factions out there. The last update didn't really hold back too much with the nerfs though. The Triumph went up to a whopping 250 points, and basically the vast majority of the Bringers of Flame staples that they had went up slightly. The Castigator, Immolator, Dominions, Paragon suits with Val, the Seraphim, and the enhancements. The only buffs that they got in return were Battle Sisters and the Zephyrim going down a bit. Their army rule is their acts of faith with generating the miracle dice and subbing them into big rolls, hitting the enemy with huge damage results from multi-melters and the like. The Games Workshop said that they'd be changing that in some way in the upcoming balance update. Really not sure what they're going to go with there, maybe to try and smooth out the mechanic a bit in some way. For detachment choice post-update, it did look like they wanted to hit the Bringers of Flame and bring it more in line. It still seems that it is the single most played detachment. Despite this, it does just fit very well with close-range melters and flamers getting there and being extra dangerous when they do. Though it does look like it's helped a lot in terms of the diversity of detachments being chosen to be played. Hello Martyrs is also doing absolutely great as well. Maybe not quite as many direct immediate damage buffs, but some really helpful things with some powerful stratagems to manipulate melee. Plus having characters being able to stand up on death is rather powerful, and particularly more than Val. I feel like the points changes they did have broadly been a good thing for internal balance. Perhaps the good stuff not feeling quite as heavily above the other things that didn't see as much play before. In general, most stuff that was good remains it though. Val and Paragons remain an absolute staple. The Castigator still seems auto-include for most lists. Dominions, Immolators and Seraphim or Bringers of Flame do very nicely. Maybe a few more Battle Sister squads thrown into the mix in there too as well at the cheaper points cost. It was interesting to see that the Triumph of St. Catherine is still taken at the 250 points in a few top-performing competitive lists, seeing as those Auto 6 miracles just seem to be that good apparently. Maybe Canonesses and Palatines being the most common HQ choices with various enhancements, and some armies deciding to go heavy on the Exorcists, as arguably one of the game's best indirect fire choices when not a lot else is particularly good on that front. As usual, Sisters maybe tend to be a slightly higher skill faction to play. The units aren't really all that tough for the cost, and with short-range melter things there's often a bit of commitment of trying to push units out and deal enough damage to justify the sacrifice before they wind up getting killed in return. Plus the Miracle Dice resource to manage as well as the command points, and deciding where the high rolls can most help deliver victory. Will be interesting to see what happens in terms of their rules in December though. Sounds like there's going to be at least some changes in store for them. Next up, and certainly vying for one of the strongest factions in Warhammer 40k at the moment, is the Astra Militarum. 52% wins right now, which improved around about 3% or so on the last time, and easily winning the most tournaments out of any faction currently with 8 big event wins since the update, plenty more high placings, and loads of people choosing to put them on the table, the second most competitively played army at the moment. Though even bearing that in mind, that's still an excessive number of tournament wins. Perhaps the biggest thing to impact the faction recently was the fact that they got their Tempestus Aquilons from the Kill Team set. Kind of golly to have 10 objective control on a 3-inch deep strike for 90 points, and their damage output's well capable of clearing out some larger objective holding units, plus certain shenanigans that they've been able to do with rapid ingress, which sounds like it's changing soon. Otherwise, in the last update, they did have the one focal nerf of Borgrins going up, which were being spammed a lot, but otherwise their tank commander got pricier but gained Squadron, which was largely seen as kind of fine to possibly a gain, and Scout Sentinels got cheaper, which were already a great datasheet, and Ogrins and Field Ordnance went down a bit as well. In game, their core mechanic are their orders for extra movement, +1 to hit, or +1 saves and things, quite flexible to be able to turn on extra speed or damage when you need it, and their Born Soldiers rule was drastically improved in one of the previous updates, getting lethal hits for the majority of their army against certain targets, tanks being good at destroying vehicles and monsters, infantry being better against most other things. They've also got their reinforcements to resurrect a unit, fields of 5 for extra AP in a focused way, and the Grand Strategist enhancement often makes an appearance for extra orders. For their strong units right now, the vast majority of their big unit pool is pretty competitively relevant. As mentioned, the Aquilons are kind of godly. Their tanks can bring serious amounts of firepower, Rogor Dawns and various other patterns of Russes backed up by tank commanders, and Lord Solar broadcasting out some orders. He himself is rather amazing with the command point generation on top of that. Scout Sentinels for 55 points are just ridiculously efficient. Kastan Jungle Fighters and Chimeras can grab the midfield well, maybe backed up by Hellhounds, Rough Riders, Ogrins or Borgrins still. The indirect fire has been nerfed from before, but it's still usable, maybe particularly Basilisks for annoyingly slowing units. 20 strong infantry squads, such as Krieg with a Marshal, can be things to gum up the midboard. Gaunt's Ghosts can go bouncing around claiming secondary objectives, and Scions and Command Squads have become a bit more of a mainstream thing now, dropping down to bring a big special weapon damage punch out of Deep Strike, which can cut down a huge amount of elite infantry and threaten tanks and vehicles too. Overall, they're definitely one of the strongest armies in the game right now, with a huge amount of powerful options available to them. Perhaps their melee prowess took a bit of a hit with the Borgrins going up so much, but generally with a good list played well, they've certainly got the tools to win. I say probably the biggest thing that's going to have them toned down is inevitable Tempestus Aquilon nerfs at the next balance update, and then a new codex on the horizon which is probably going to change the way that they play in a big way. It could certainly be interesting, but is no guarantee to be strong given Games Workshop's history with 10th edition books. Next up, one of the biggest winners out of the last balance update were the Death Guard. They've been pumped up to win rates around about 53%, so gaining like +4 on last time. They've won 3 big events since the balance update, and they're being played by a whole bunch of people as a result. They're the 6th most played faction out of the 26 armies, which is definitely far higher than normal for them. They were already kind of mid-tier and doing alright enough. Then in the last updates they got cheaper Death Shroud, which was kind of crazy. Plenty of people running 18 of them at the moment, sort of doing Custodes but Death Guard. Mortarion himself is fantastic value at 300 points. The Biologist Putrefier got cheaper, who was an auto-include for leading Plague Marines already, and allies such as the Beast of Nurgle and Wardog Brigands, which were both at least fairly commonly used, both got cheaper as well. For their core army rule, they have the Gift of Nurgle with a -1 toughness aura for their enemies, and detachments doubling down on that with a debuff, often the extra AP one where it's relevant, plus the sticky objectives that can become infected. They get lots of lethal hits on their datasheets, which keep most units at least somewhat relevant against tough stuff. Though I feel like maybe their strats and enhancements don't tend to be the biggest focus of their power. They do have some okay damage and defensive ones, but don't really feel like the core of the strength in the way that some other factions have. For standout units, Typhus is basically auto-include, big mortal wounds and a massive stat line for less points than he probably should be. Death Shroud have enormous stats for the cost. They could just foot slog towards a midfield objective or rapid ingress, their main weakness being their 4-inch movement, which could lead to them being screened or outplayed, but they're definitely a problem unit. Mortarion for 300 points is a great heart of the army with his ignores modifiers, a massive defensive stat line that's going to be borderline worth trying to deal with at that points cost. Their armoured things can work well. Bloat drones and predator destructors tend to be some of the most common ones out of the codex. I like Wardog Brigands, like the extra debuffs that Contagions can bring. Blight Haulers are alright for some anti-elite or vehicle sort of firepower. And one of the most dangerous units can be a whole bunch of Plague Marines and Rhinos, backed up by a Biologist Putrefier, and maybe a Foul Blight Spawn if you want fights first as well. They can also dip into some Chaos Demons, say for some allied Nurglings to screen things out turn 1, or drop to do some secondaries that don't require OC. Overall, I've just got loads of raw disease-ridden strength right now. Maybe for any criticisms, I guess certain datasheets get played less these days, things like Blight Lords and Plague Burst Crawlers. A bunch of their characters maybe don't feel super well balanced. There's definitely winners and losers for leading the Plague Marines, and if you do go for the big spam of lots of Death Shroud Terminators, lots of armies just won't be able to handle that, but it might not work quite so well at an absolute top level of play, with people a bit better at screening, move blocking, or outpacing them. They certainly feel like an intimidating army to see on the other side of the tabletop at the moment though. Next up, we've got the Denizens of the Warp themselves in Chaos Demons. They didn't have terrible win rates prior to the updates, though it's gone up a bit since then, 53% up from 51. Two biggest tournament wins since the balance pass. They're not really being taken by a huge amount of event attendees. 15th out of 26 seems kind of normalish for them, maybe not desperately outstanding there. The last balance update maybe gave them a particularly notable boost in Shalaxi Hellbane getting cheaper, who was already a fairly scary greater demon to start with, who can kill most big stuff. Cheaper Beasts of Nurgle didn't hurt, though the Ren Master on the Blood Throne got a bit more expensive, which was a small nerf to overall Khorne melee spam. Their rules revolve around the Shadow of Chaos with areas of control and debuffing enemies, though now the greater demons exude an aura of that, and that makes them far more powerful and necessary in every list. Their detachment rule gives them warp rifts for some close deep strike in the shadow of the warp, so they can basically walk straight into melee with you. They play very differently to lots of other factions out there. Big invulnerable saves, everything can deep strike, much more melee than range, and then shenanigans such as taking things off the board and 3-inch deep striking them. There's an advanced and charged stratagem, and pretty much all the enhancements are really very good right now, given that every greater demon permanently gets the boosted effect due to their own Shadow of Chaos. With the need to be able to take down enemy tough stuff, plus the Shadow of Chaos aura, the greater demons have just become more and more central to the army. Most competitive lists seem to be running, say, around about 4 or so of them, sometimes more. That's the Great Unclean one, with the 4+ Feel No Pain being the single most auto-include, but beyond that, just about all the rest are very playable. The core melee stuff can do nicely enough, Blood Crushers, Flesh Hounds and Bloodletters, maybe a Ren Master to support them, though he does cost more. And beyond that, I'd say the vast majority of the lesser demons are useful enough that you kind of only want so many of them versus the greaters. Perhaps Flamers, Plague Bearers, Beasts of Nurgle, Seekers and Nurglings being a few of the ones that see a little bit more use, but most of them tend to be in a bit more of a supporting role compared with the mainstay of armies. Perhaps the biggest downsides, their reliance on just a few huge models for most lists might give them some sort of the same element of being a bit of a stat check and somewhat similar to armies like Knights, where you've only got so much scope for clever play, and you might struggle with primary objectives a little bit, or having some tough choices as to what does secondaries if some of your objective grabbing demons get shot. In general, in the high levels of play, they're not tending to be seen as one of the armies to go to for the best chance of winning grand tournaments, though it seems that they're doing kind of equivalently to quite a few factions out there, including I think winning the single biggest tournament since the update, at least at time of recording. In any case though, for most players, Chaos Demons are being a bit of a power trip army at the moment, certainly a big challenge to deal with big scary stat lines that can warp around the board. Finally though, it looks like this time around there's just one faction that really seems to stick out the top in terms of the statistics, and it seems that Ascension Day really has come for the Genestealer Cult, as it really looked like it was going to when they did the last points update. They're quite a long way clear of everything else at the moment, and perhaps the single most faction likely to attract some nerfs at the next balance pass. Putting them on the big table, that puts them really quite a long way ahead of the vast majority of other stuff. Pretty much the entirety of 40k's armies being between win rates 44 and 53, which is at least fairly impressive, and just the one faction out the top and out the bottom. Genestealer Cults just seem mathematically likely to be in massive ascendancy after the points changes. It now looks like they've got a 58% win rate, which is a crazy plus 16% on what they were before. Directly after the Codex, they were super weak. The Games Workshop gave them a really meaningful buff in a quiet interim balance update between them, and doubled down with massive points cuts after that. They've won 6 big events since the balance update happened, which is the second most after Astra Militarum, but far more impressive than them as they're one of the least played armies in the game, 19th out of the 26 factions, so it shows that you've got an outsized chance to win tournaments as the Genestealer Cult, and even that low play rate is kind of excessively big for them. They're one of 40k's fewest and least played factions. The last update that they had gave them some pretty massive points buffs. Battle line units all dropped by 5 points, which felt like a pretty massive direct buff to the faction. The Primus went down, who's also a pretty key HQ. The Jackals dropping to 80 was a big deal for them. Small units of Aberrants went down, as did the Benefactors, Patriarch, and a couple of other supporting characters. The big deal was that that was all on top of a pretty biggish buff that they gave to Cult Ambush in a quite errata sort of document, like 4 weeks after the launch of Pariah Nexus, which just casually said that Cult Ambush units can come back via standard deep strike, as opposed to having to wait around till the next turn for their blip tokens, which the opponent had loads of counterplay to, and often would mean that units would set up really far back and not able to get back into the fight. I think it's at least kind of hard to underestimate how big a deal that was to the faction, as it basically means that when you recycle units, rather than them coming in an unhelpful place and maybe getting back into the enemy, say turn 4 or 5 if you're lucky, units pretty much ping back at full strength right in the enemy's face, all ready to do some shooting and charging. Besides that points buff and the good mechanic, it looks like the various attachments to some good success besides the Brood Brothers one. Biosantic Brood Surge gets you easy charges out of Deep Strike and big hitting Pure Strains and Aberrants. That does feel like a fun one with throwing loads of melee around out of Deep Strike. Host of Ascension is a fairly well balanced one with interesting things like 3-inch drops and massive neophyte damage combos that you can throw out of reserve, plus easy charges for certain melee units too. Outlander Claw was the most successful prior to the update, though now just seems to be one of many. That one gives you big objective control for the Jackals, Transports and Ridge Runners, and a few other interesting things besides. And Xenocreed Congregation is lesser played than the other three it seems, though it looks like it's doing okay for the few people using it, and got some very direct focal improvements with the battle line costs dropping. Otherwise, besides battle line and the things already mentioned, the Achilles Ridge Runner is a staple synergy unit, handing out extra AP. They've got a good contingent of lone operatives, which can be handy enough for secondary objectives and board control. Maybe the Kellamorph might be my favourite, with his move shoot move style shenanigans, and otherwise a lot of the rest of their small roster is a little bit detachment dependent, particularly for the Biosantic Brood Surge and Outlander Claw. For downsides, perhaps the biggest one to point at might be big swings on whether certain units respawn or not. If the opponent kills a big scary unit turn 1 and it just chooses not to return to reserve, it's either going to be a big boon or a big disappointment, and one that players can't really control all that well. And despite having a lot of power, just generally they tend to be an army that works far better in the hands of someone who really knows all their tricks and the best things to do with them. There's big options for the different ways that you can bring things back from Deep Strike as to how to control the game to destroy the enemy army or focus on winning via victory points. And particularly on the damage game, there can be some big swings as to whether or not the units that you line up manage to kill their targets, or whether they fall foul of Overwatch or some other nastiness. Despite that though, for the moment, I feel like for the average player, with some experience and a somewhat strong list, Genestealer Cult should be more forgiving than most, and are almost certainly going to attract some nerfs in the next balance update. We also know that Cult Ambush will be changing somehow. I feel like if anything, Cult Ambush should probably be made a little bit more reliable to get units back. They'll possibly try and have some more focus on the blip tokens once again, but make sure that the faction doesn't wind up being too strong overall by appropriate points costs if a few things have to rise. Until any balance changes happen though, it looks like Genestealer Cult have got good arguments to be the top faction in 40k. Though despite the win rate differentials, I feel like Guard aren't really all that far behind, and there might be a bit of distortion of those by the types of players that collect Guard versus Genestealer Cult. In any case though, just to do a couple of roundups of the different stats out there. First, here's the overall win percentage graph. Genestealer Cults out the top, Demons, Death Guard, Sisters, Astra Militarum, Votann, Blood Angels and Necrons doing well. Space Marines, Templars and Imperial Agents rounding out the bottom. For actual event wins though, it's Astra Militarum heading up the table, followed by Genestealer Cult, then Necrons, Chaos Marines and Orks, all doing far better here than their win rates would suggest. Death Guard, Sisters and Votann doing rather well too. But in general, it's just kind of nice to see that the vast majority of factions of 40k are winning events, and I feel like this one could be a little bit on the random side as well, a bit dependent on whether certain players have a great day or not. Would definitely be improved by a few more months of data on this one. Then there's the play rate of armies at big tournaments. Necrons head this one up, followed closely after by Astra Militarum, Tyranids, Tau, Blood Angels and Death Guard also being on the upper end as well. Basically no one's playing Imperial Agents, and otherwise it looks like it's Thousand Sons, Black Templars and Admech on the lower end of that. Certainly seems like more people are playing Genestealer Cults than normal, given that they usually hang out down there, and maybe some of the same sort of thing for Drukhari and Space Wolves as well. Finally, just to smash a couple of those stats together, here's the event wins per play rate. So basically number of those grand tournament wins by the amount of people who are playing the faction. Though again, as mentioned, there will be a bit of an element of randomness to this, given low numbers of event wins overall. As there's only so many 40k tournaments that get played each week, it's still not really surprising that Genestealer Cults absolutely overperform on that one though. Astra Militarum are still up there, but otherwise a fair few factions shake up the formula a little bit. Thousand Sons seem to do well on this metric, with just a small number of people sticking with them doing well still. Black Templars might feel like they've had a little bit of luck with those tournament wins and are inflated by a spectacularly small player base, but otherwise leagues of Votann, Orks, Chaos Marines and Imperial Knights are doing okay on that front too. Looks like it's the Agents, Adeptus Mechanicus and Blood Angels that are making up the bottom end of that list. I definitely feel like some of the bottom end could be kind of randomness though. I certainly feel like the Admech have got some potential to do better. Just kind of show that Blood Angels are maybe struggling a bit at top levels, despite high win rates and a fair few high placings though. And a whole load of people are playing the faction. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts as always. Let me know what you make of the different armies and their performance out there in 40k down in the comments below. Finally for this one, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Warhammer Combat Cards. As mentioned earlier, basically a 40k themed mobile game, where you build a deck of cards around a warlord, fight them in short runs of battles against other people's decks automated by a computer, and could be of interest to some of you as something to pass the time as a 40k themed distraction. Having played the game a bit myself, I think the things that I most enjoyed about it was the sense of constant progression, never really losing anything, which is nice enough for a lower stress distraction. I feel like I prefer the ones where there's not the chance to go too far backwards. The games are fairly short and punchy and to the point, kind of nice if you need something quick to fill a gap. And there is some genuine strategy out there, the biggest thing being the deck building element of it and trying out different builds and trying to make other warlords and things work. And in game maybe a little bit of scope for intelligent play with using abilities and things, though perhaps a little bit more limited on that level. For criticisms, bear in mind it's a mobile free-to-play game with all that entails. I certainly go in expecting a bit of fun and entertainment as opposed to anything too high-minded. It certainly won't be for everyone if you don't like mobile games. As mentioned, the battle strategy can be a little bit limited, mainly about trying to make some bad matchups for opponents' cards if it's possible, and sometimes decks might counter each other a little. It can be a bit on the grindy side, though I'm not hugely against that in a mobile game really. There is of course the inevitable microtransaction shop that I personally not use on principle. Mobile games do generally have an element of pay to succeed faster, even if it's not directly pay to win, though that's never been something that's ever interested me. It also needs an internet connection to function properly, and from online reviews it looks like there's some occasional reports of glitching and freezing, though it tends to be worse for the PC version versus the mobile apparently. In any case, I think it could be of interest to some people out there, even if it's not for everyone. They tend to release content in a similar sort of lockstep with Games Workshop's release schedule. For example, The Line and some Dark Angels coming out when their codex did in 2024, and have seasons of play with some occasional balance patches, where they've built up quite a lot of content to explore now, around about 880 cards in the game, all which can level up, and you can play with most 40k factions. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave the links down in the video description below. And if you wanted the bonus of some free stuff in game, then there's the code auspextactics as a referral one, and that gets 40 Space Marine cards plus a bit of the in-game currency. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. Thanks very much for watching the video, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. It'll be interesting to see how the next balance pass impacts on these standings. If you've enjoyed and would like to support further, there's a bunch of links in the video description, the channel's Patreon page, plus the discount affiliate links and everything. Feel free to check them out if you'd like to, though otherwise an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.